Good day, business owners and leaders. It is my great pleasure to join with some of the most highly respected, experienced, knowledgeable experts in their respective fields and present to you episode 1 of our new series, Business Rising Advisors. Our purpose is simple: to provide you with a synopsis of the most relevant legal and business information you will need as you build, and in many instances, rebuild your businesses towards the success that you deserve. We're here for the long haul to help you in the rebuilding process and to conquer the new normal together. On our team is Marie DeSante, the firm's managing partner at Carruthers, DeSante and Freudenberger. They are leading lawyers for employers, advising, representing companies on potential legal claims by workers. Also joining us is Anita Nygaard, president of Core HR Inc., a leading consultant in the field of HR and organizational policy. Anita is always on top of the most recent employment legislation so that employers know how best to apply them in their companies and on their teams. Also, Philip Wilson, the managing partner for California region for Markham LLP, one of the largest independent public accounting and advisory services in the nation, with a presence in the U.S. and abroad. Phil is also a former IRS agent, offering us invaluable insight into the tax and accounting landscape going forward. And Barry Weber, a privacy practice leader at Assured SBC. He's a seasoned information technology, privacy, and security leader with a keen focus on helping business owners to protect their data, manage risk, and implement fresh direction as they grow into a strong IT and security framework. And I'm Saji Gunawarden, founder and principal attorney at the law firm of U.S. Business Counsel, where we serve as efficient, highly involved outside general counsel to growing businesses, offering a comprehensive, flat-fee corporate counsel program that's unique among experienced business law firms. Each of us joins the Business Rising Advisors team with a commitment to you, to educating business owners so that you can navigate the legal and business hurdles, as well as seize new opportunities to get your footing as you rise again. With that, I'd like to start with Marie. Marie, employers everywhere are going to have to grapple with this new paradigm of remote work. So let's start with the basics. How do you determine who can work remotely?
Very good question, and the answer has changed dramatically almost overnight. Before the COVID-19 pandemic, most employers, when asked the question, may I work remotely, may I work from home, often the immediate reaction was, no, you can't. And there wasn't really much analysis done on whether it really could be possible or not. Since COVID-19, the employers really are faced with the choice of it's either remote work or it's no work. And so now, all of a sudden, they're realizing, well, maybe the remote work is possible, or at least possible to a certain extent where we can at least get some productivity out of our employees. And so employers need to initially assess, can the work be done remotely? In some positions, like a warehouse position, it's really not possible. In other positions, like many office worker positions, often the job can be done remotely, or at least some portion of the job can be done remotely. And employers do have the flexibility in deciding what can be done remotely and what percentage of the job can be done remotely. So they can narrow the scope of a position. For an exempt employee, perhaps they say 75% of your job can be done remotely, so your pay will be 75% of what it used to be. For hourly workers, you can say we expect maybe 6 hours of work a day as opposed to 8 hours of work a day. And you can modify the position to accommodate the quantity of work that you think an employee can do from a remote location. In other positions, they might be able to do the entire job remotely.
Well, that makes sense, Marie. So let me ask you a question then. How does that have implications on exempt versus non-exempt employees and essentially wage and hour?
It's a little easier to manage if it's an exempt employee. The main thing you really need to think about with exempt employees is what percentage of their function can they do remotely, and then you can do a proportionate pay decrease if you think it's going to be less than what you normally would expect from the person if they were in the office. With non-exempt or hourly employees, there are huge implications because employers need to keep track of not just how many hours they work, but they need to keep track of exactly when they clock in for their job function, when they stop for a meal break, when they clock back in after a meal break, when they clock out at the end of the day. Employers are also responsible for making sure that non-exempt employees have breaks available. It's a little harder when you're working remotely to say the employer has prevented you from taking a break, but still you need to have policies in place that say, even though you're working remotely, let's say from home, that you know you have to take your 10-minute rest break or have the ability to take a 10-minute rest break for every 4 hours of work or major fraction thereof, that you take your meal break at the right time, and that you properly log in and out for the meal break. It's very important, and it's very important to pay based on those actual logins and logouts of time. And it's important to make sure employees know they cannot do any off-the-clock work. Even if they're just checking emails for 10 minutes before they go to bed at night, which normally they might not do, particularly as a non-exempt employee, that needs to be recorded and it needs to be paid.
Well, that's interesting, and that is it's an adjustment for both employers and employees, a great deal of adjustment there.
Definitely, particularly for the hourly workers.
Right. So we're talking a lot about sort of where we are today and how they can adjust accordingly. In this post-pandemic paradigm, though, what are the implications now that we've made these adjustments and now we've cleared through this period of time, this challenging period? What are some things you'd advise employers to consider now that, say, it's a certain day and a certain month and we're post-pandemic?
Well, one thing to consider is, do you still allow the remote work? Now, some people have gotten used to working remotely. The younger generation already was expecting more of that. So to the extent you pull back on the ability of people to work remotely, it could have implications on recruiting and retention of employees. So that's something to definitely keep in mind. Another issue is disability accommodation. One of the biggest challenges employers face is, how do you accommodate an employee who has a disability? And many times, one of the accommodations that employees request is the ability to work remotely. And pre-pandemic, it was often the reaction of employers to say, no, that can't be done. We don't allow it pursuant to our policies, or it's just not feasible. Well, now we will have just exited a period of time where we've demonstrated that it can be done. Maybe not quite as efficiently, but it can be done. And so now it's going to be much harder for employers to say, no, remote work is not a reasonable accommodation for a particular disability that an employee may have. So that analysis certainly needs to change if employees are requesting that. Another thing that's going to change is the expense reimbursement analysis. During the pandemic, if people are forced to work from home, a lot of expenses that they may occur in connection with that remote work need to be reimbursed by the employer. Like, for instance, cell phone usage, internet, Wi-Fi access, office supplies, and you have to reimburse that because it's required to do the job. Post-pandemic, if you make it an option and employees have the ability to do the work in the office, but they choose to work from home and the employer allows it, there isn't quite as much of a requirement on employers to pay for that, because there are alternatives. The employee can use the office, they can use the office supplies, they can use the company phone if the company gives them a phone, they can use the company Wi-Fi. So you will have a little more flexibility. So during pandemic, much heavier burden on expense reimbursement. Post-pandemic, maybe not as much if the remote work is optional as opposed to mandated.
That's nicely laid out, Marie. Phil, what are your takes on that as far as that employee expense reimbursement aspect too?
Right. The employees no longer have the ability to deduct any of that. The employee business expenses went away a few years ago, but the employers do have the ability to. So for something like Marie was saying, with your cell phones, et cetera, you have that ability. But even it could even go so far as equipment. You know, computer monitors, you know, ergonomic chairs, things like that. I mean, the employer has an ability to purchase those and deduct them on behalf of the employee, where the employee gets no benefit from the deduction. So I think we're seeing some of that during this time.
I see. Well, that makes sense. And it is dynamic. You mentioned the tax code change, and who would have thought that such change again would hit us so soon with these implications.
Right. I mean, we just got through the you know, the TCJA, you know, a couple of years ago, and now all of a sudden a lot of those positions are reversed. So we'll talk about those in a little while.
Right. Thank you for that, Phil. Marie, thanks for that. Are there other implications you want to point out to us as far as employers and considerations in the post-pandemic? Because what we're doing here with our series is not just talking about how to adjust and navigate where we are today, but also thinking about positioning those employers for the next phase. You covered a lot of great things there. Anything else that you want to mention?
One thing I'll say, being an employer myself, as an employment attorney in a law firm, is the opening up the doors to remote work could definitely help employers reduce their real estate expense. And so that is another positive, because one of the, next to payroll, the biggest expense for employers is their occupancy costs.
Sure.
And if you can minimize your real estate footprint, you can save a tremendous amount of money as a business, as an employer. And so it's another advantage and worth keeping in mind once we get through the pandemic and you're starting to think about, well, how much of this remote work should I allow? Because I think the more people work outside the office, they don't need as big an office, they don't need as nice an office, and they can share an office. And there's going to be so many ways to reduce costs that way that I think will be very valuable as time rolls on.
That's great advice. And the interesting thing about this, as I hear both of you speak, is there's a strong, and I guess I'm biased in this, but there's a strong human dynamic to this, a human dynamic factor, that how we interact with our employees and how we set expectations now has implications for the future as well. And that's probably going to also affect how legislation takes shape going forward too. With that, we're talking about the protocols and policies. How do employees follow what they need to follow, and how do we draft those protocols accordingly? I want to bring in Anita here to talk about what she sees from that perspective, because I know, Anita, you are sort of deep in the weeds, always talking to employers about protocols, modifying them, customizing them accordingly. That was in a pre-pandemic world. Now we have this new federal legislation that's passed, and I know you're studying that pretty deeply as well. Can you talk to us a little bit about how the new federal legislation has implications on employee protocols and the employer's workplace?
Sure, Saji. One of the areas that we've been looking at is telecommuting agreements and telework agreements. So as employees are now having to change to working remotely, it's up to the employer to communicate just how responsive they need to be and how protocols need to be set up so that so that both employees and employers are following the same amount of expectations to know that they're going to be performing to expectations overall to get their jobs done. And understanding that there are more distractions at home, it's a little bit more of a juggle to make sure that employers are allowing employees to communicate when they need to just be available to balance those personal and family obligations. There need to be allowable times when you can't participate in a Zoom meeting, for example, because you do need to take care of personal or family obligations, seeing that school children are home for the rest of the school year at this point.
That makes sense. So if I were to ask you from your perspective now, and I know you're working with essential businesses and non-essential businesses alike right now, between yourself and Phil and Marie and Barry and I were consulting with these businesses, but what do you see as the primary concern that you're hearing about?
So some of the primary concerns that we're hearing about right now is for employees that work remote, sometimes they feel that they need to be available around the clock. So having some boundaries. There's also some isolation feelings from employees that now don't have that interaction or collaboration directly with coworkers or with managers that might have been close by. So it's really important to keep in mind the visual sightlines that something like a video conference can provide, regardless of what technology that you use. It's very helpful to pick up on the visual cues, expressions, and body language. And that all adds into is that individual tracking with you? Do you have agreement? Do you have consensus? Is there a misunderstanding? Is there something you need to look into further? Is someone's demeanor starting to dip or go down? Do people feel socially isolated? In that case, employers can let employees know that they may have employee assistance program or other counseling services available through their medical health care programs that employees may want to make use of. Or even if that employee is dealing with being long distance from relatives, perhaps they need to tap into those services to help how they now manage relationships with family that are far away and that they can't see regularly.
Those are excellent points. That brings to mind, though, specifics of the legislation itself. It was last month, on the 27th of March, that the President signed the CARES Act, essentially a new $2 trillion economic stimulus package, which also included a lot on employee benefits and information that's germane for all business owners to be aware of. What does the CARES Act itself provide for businesses that don't want to terminate employees because they value them and they risk losing them to the marketplace once things do rise up again, and there are concerns still of balancing that with unemployment issues. So what are, in summary, the issues that you're seeing that the CARES Act does provide for business owners to be aware of?
Right. Well, we're glad to say that the CARES Act provides alternatives to closure and layoffs. And some of the biggest concerns that we're hearing from employers is, just as you said, dispersing their teams of valued talent, which they've carefully built up over the years, and also not knowing what to communicate about when employees can be rehired. So it makes employees and employers feel mutually vulnerable and helpless. Under the CARES Act, however, and go over several points here that this program provides, rather than a stimulus program, I really see it more as a stabilizer. That's what we need at this point in time. So
right.
Some of these key points are allocating $349 billion for what's affectionately been started to become known as the Triple P, the Paycheck Protection Program, and this is huge. It authorizes the Small Business Administration, or the SBA, to provide forgivable loans to small businesses, nonprofits, veterans organizations, and even certain tribal entities. These may be used for payroll expenses, such as employee salaries and paid sick or medical leave, insurance premiums, and otherwise mortgage rent and utility payments. Forgiveness is structured to incentivize employers to keep employees on their payroll, which helps those small businesses that are afraid of dispersing their talent. It also allocates $500 billion for assistance to businesses, states, and municipalities, another $130 billion to medicals and hospital industries, including for medical supplies and drug and device shortages. These are concerns we're hearing on the news every night. It authorizes another $10 billion to provide emergency grants of up to $10,000 for small businesses under the separate program under the SBA, the Economic Injury Disaster Loans, or EIDL program. We've also heard about a stimulus to individuals making $75,000 or less and heads of household. And the stimulus can be $1,200 for individuals, or additional monies for joint earning couples, those making $99,000 or less, and $500 for each child. And last but not least, it certainly gets into expanding unemployment insurance benefits. So for workers that have been furloughed or laid off that need to rely on that income, there is some additional funding from the federal government, which will be a big help.
Excellent. Well, there's a lot in that a lot of punch in the $2 trillion. We know that. Among those things, I want to ask you about two areas in particular. You mentioned the Paycheck Protection Program. And there's also this federal expansion, as I alluded to earlier, on the unemployment side too. These are rapidly evolving, they're out the gate, and as we have future episodes, we'll expand upon the discussion there too. But let's start with the PPP. It's a loan program, right?
It is a loan program. These loans are designed to lessen the impact of the unfavorable economic conditions that currently exist by providing a direct incentive for small businesses to keep workers on the payroll. So the loans consist of 2.5 times the average monthly payroll cost from the prior year, so 2019. And it can cover payroll and other certain expenses, including healthcare benefits, mortgage or rent, and utilities. And then in addition, if the business maintains its workforce, the SBA will forgive the portion of the loan proceeds used to cover the first 8 weeks of payroll.
Let's talk a little bit about that aspect of forgiveness, Anita, because I think that's the part that could be a little confusing for business owners. I mean, I have this money, I can apply for it, I can get it. How much of it is forgivable? What are the terms for that? So just in general, tell us about, in your perspective, eligibility and forgiveness.
Well, the loans may be eligible for forgiveness up to the amount not to exceed the loan principal spent by the business during an 8-week period after the origination date of the loan. And so you can use those proceeds on payroll, mortgage, interest, rent, and utilities. And then the SBA goes on to spell out that not more than 25% of the loan forgiveness may be attributed to non-payroll costs, and at least
important.
75%. Yes, it is important.
That's important to know, because we're talking about businesses that it's not just the employee dynamic itself or that burden, if you will, quote unquote. It's the actual capital expenditures of running a business, property and capital and lease. So that's good to know.
Yes, that's exactly right. Some businesses have equipment that needs to be maintained, building repairs that may need to be made. So if 75% of the loan proceeds are used on payroll costs, then the other 25% can be used on non-payroll costs.
Now, Phil, as you hear this discussion, I know you've digested this information just the same from an accounting perspective, but that raises a lot of questions also about future deductions and implications on the next round of tax reporting, right?
Well, the forgiveness component is supposed to be tax-free, which is surprising because usually debt forgiveness is income. So what you have here is the ability for the business to use that money. And the real point of it is to continue the payroll, because there's a measurement period with your prior payroll.
Of course.
And so then they measure that against the forgiveness. So you get the amount of the loan, which is your payroll from the prescribed period, 2.5 times that. And then the forgiveness piece, you have to use, like Aeneas said, you have to use 75% of it. Well, if you're doing that, I think the reason why they have the forgiveness component in there is A, they want to reduce the unemployment ranks, and B, they know that the business owners are going to be having reduced sales and revenue numbers anyway. So I think that's the main reason why. So who knows how everything pans out, but that's why that's designed that way.
Yeah, and as you just alluded to, it is it's out the gate. It's fresh. It's hot, but it's evolving, and likely there'll be future legislation and amendments to clarify and guide.
Right, and Anita, I'm sure you're seeing it also. It's changing almost every day.
Yeah. So Anita, let me ask you back to the PPP itself. Can a company use proceeds to pay independent contractors, for instance? That has been a hot issue. You and I have talked about this to our employer clients too, when legislation passed and prior court rulings talking about what is an independent contractor. Well, now today, can this legislation cover their pay?
That's a great question, Saji. Under the PPP, no, independent contractors cannot be covered by the small businesses. However, there is a feature where independent contractors have the ability to apply for their own loan. So payments to ICs will not count for the purposes of the forgiveness. But small businesses can certainly let the contractors who they work with know that they can apply for their own loan under the PPP program.
That makes sense, and it seems to, in theory, that should work, and we'll see how that plays out. But let me ask you then, in that case, for those independent contractors, not employees, obviously they're the workers, what assistance will they actually receive in addition to state benefits from their respective states, and for how long?
So independent contractors can apply for a PPP loan on their own, and then they can provide payroll data as well. However, their independent contractors and some other workers that normally wouldn't qualify for unemployment may also apply for unemployment. And this would be under the new federal pandemic unemployment assistance program that is also part of the CARES Act. So on the one hand, we were just talking about options for small businesses to not have to lay off or furlough their employees. And on the other hand, the other aspect of the CARES Act is for those workers, including self-employed, including independent contractors, and even part-time employees or folks with an insufficient work history. These folks can apply for unemployment. And you will now be allowed to have additional supplemental unemployment benefits coming directly from the federal government that can enhance the length of time as well as the amount of unemployment that you can receive.
I want to ask a question that kind of brings in Marie here too, because all these things are ripe with challenge too. And Marie, as you hear this and you hear about the interaction of independent contractors and employees and their benefits and whatnot, are there any particular claims you see, potential claims that employers should be aware of from the perspective of these benefits being applied correctly and the employer's responsibility versus the worker's responsibility, those types of things?
Well, I think it brings to the forefront the classification issue of workers as independent contractors, and it just highlights the distinction. And even before the COVID-19 pandemic, it was an increasingly growing area of litigation.
Indeed it
And
was.
so I think it just highlights the fact that employers need to be really careful about how workers are classified, because if they're classified as independent contractors and they really should have been getting benefits of employees, then perhaps an element of damage in future litigation is going to be the benefits they should have gotten as employees under the programs employers are putting in place now, that they didn't get because they were considered independent contractors. So it just highlights the importance of employers to really assess, am I properly classifying this worker as an employee or an independent contractor?
As if that area wasn't dynamic enough before the pandemic, it's going to be something very interesting to see how that unsettles and settles in the future months.
Exactly.
Phil, your input was very helpful for us to understand those implications where the tax code amendments may be changing. But let me ask you now that Anita raised the CARES Act. On the SBA loan assistance itself, the Paycheck Protection Program, the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program, there's so much out there, Phil. I mean, from a practical perspective, I'm a business owner. What is the number one question that you, as an accounting lead, are getting from clients about this SBA loan program?
Well, the number one thing, we're hearing a lot more about the Paycheck Protection Program than we are about the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program.
Okay.
And the reason for that is, number one, there's a forgivable component. Number two, it's not subject to a personal guarantee. So when you look at the economic disaster loan, there's a longer payback period. You have up to 30 years to pay it back. But in this one, the Paycheck Protection Program, it's only a 24-month payback period, and it's delayed until 6 months after the loan funds. But that forgivable component is huge because most of our clients and most of the small businesses out there have employees, and they need that money to pay the employees. And as long as they do that and they fall within the measurement period, they can get substantially all of it or a good part of it forgiven. Now, if it's something where they aren't going to hold on to the employees and they don't have employees during that period, they're not going to get the forgiveness. And so that's kind of an opportunity where we talk to our clients and say, you may not have those employees now, but by the way, the bank isn't funding that today. And so by the time you get it in and by the time that goes through, where are you going to be at? Is it a couple weeks down the line? What's it look like at that point? When is business going to be reopening? And then if you take that next eight-week measurement period, you might very well be hiring back your employees. And if you don't, then you're on the hook and you pay back the loan.
Those are excellent points because it's very fluid. You're right. And that also brings to mind my thought on what does this really look like, even from an IT security perspective? And Barry, we're going to ask you some of those questions so you can dive in deeper on that. But even as you hear this, Barry, are you seeing some security IT issues when we talk about the legislation itself that are being addressed or not addressed? Just focusing on the legislation itself.
The legislation itself, I think, helps to facilitate the ongoing employment of employees. But because of the pandemic, what it does is it basically has allowed employees to move to home. And that's really the biggest security issue that we face. I mean, there's good news about that and bad news about that. The good news is that we are rich in technology now. It took roughly 10 days for almost any company to shift from working on site to in the four walls of the organization to allowing employees to work from home, because there's great technology that's available. Technology such as this ability for us to be together in different places and record this meeting, the ability to forward telephone lines that 800 numbers that now can ring any phone, any place, the ability to have real-time communication between employees and managers. So managers can continuously communicate with employees through tools like Slack and Microsoft Teams.
And before we dive deeper into that, though, because I do want to hear about this aspect, but I want to also let our tax expert, accounting expert, talk more about those implications too itself. The tax landscape for businesses, in a practical perspective, like Barry mentioned, Phil, the workforce is changing, as Marie and Anita both mentioned, in the sense that the composition of the workforce might change. The way that we work remotely, like Barry said, will change, having security implications. But what are the tax implications as well for businesses to be aware of? What's sort of like, practically speaking, new date extensions, those types of things?
Well, everyone probably has already heard that the April 15th deadline has been extended 90 days until July 15th. And so what does that mean? Well, first of all, it means July 15th is essentially your April 15th. So from a perspective of having to file corporate returns, your C corporation returns, your individual tax returns, actually paying the tax that was due for 2019, normally you get an extension of time to file, not to pay. Here you have both. You have an extension of time to file. So you have to file your returns and pay the tax by July 15th. You're still eligible to take another extension and extend it out to October. But, July 15th is a new April 15th. Now, interestingly enough, the first quarter estimates that are due on April 15th have been moved to July 15th. But the second quarter estimate that's due June 15th is still June 15th.
Oh, is that right?
Now, Treasury has the right to move those. They can move all those dates and make them later. But for right now, June 15th is your first due date for your 2020 taxes.
That's helpful to
It's
hear.
interesting. So when we send it out, your second quarter comes before your first quarter. So that's interesting.
Phil, that's interesting. I made a note about this. And I wanted to ask you. It's like the tax man giveth, the tax man taketh. What does the IRS moratorium on the enforcement that they're doing? I think there's a moratorium, right, on the collection activity through middle of the summer. What does that mean for businesses?
Well, so what it means for businesses and specifically for individuals. So the IRS uses enforced collections to collect its money. They do that through bank levies, seizures, tax liens, et cetera. They put a moratorium on that from April 1st until July 15th. So again, collection activity right now is suspended. Now, if a taxpayer is in a valid installment agreement, they have the option to not make payments during that period. So from April 1st to July 15th, if you're in an installment agreement, you don't have to make those payments. Now, interest and penalties will still accrue, but you can elect not to make those payments. Now, a lot of those are set up electronically. Most of those are direct debit, so they would need to contact their banks in order to do that.
That's excellent. Are there any other aspects of the new federal legislation that you'd like to highlight, Phil? There's some key dates there, obviously, to be aware of, and like you mentioned earlier on when we were talking with Anita and Marie, these are all dynamic and they're just hot out the gate. But any other key things that you see prospectively?
Well, one of the things that's also in there, which isn't tax, but it's student loans. There's a deferral on student loans, and that includes interest as well. So not only student loan payments, but the interest. Now, the caveat is it has to be with the federal government. So if someone is refied their student loans with SoFi or a private lender, that doesn't apply unless that lender gives them that. But for the federal government, the student loans with the federal government, including the Parent Plus loans, those all have a 6-month suspension. You can still elect to pay it and it's interest free, or you can not pay it.
Thank you very much for that, Phil, that perspective. We're going to have you back, obviously, for the next episode to talk more about how these are actually playing out, if there are further amendments to the legislation that business owners should be aware of. Going back to you, Barry, I want to ask you now to dive a little deeper into the remote workplace that Marie talked about, Anita talked about, and Phil also added color to. You're about to dive deep and tell us about security issues, privacy issues, things that employers don't typically think of, but now we have to.
The challenge associated with work from home, from the security standpoint, there's a common term called the attack surface of the organization. And when every employee worked inside the four walls of the organization, then it was easier to protect what the assets were of the organization. Now what's happened is that depending upon how the technology has been set up to allow employees to work from home, more information, more assets can be reached outside the four walls of the organization. That creates, obviously, risk for the business. And those risks are the most appropriate thing to do based upon most security framework to say, let me stop right now. Once I've done what I needed to do to help the business survive, let me take one step back now and let me do a risk assessment. Let me look at the situation with respect to those assets we're trying to protect and see if we're still protecting them adequately. And then to define what kind of controls we might want to put in place to ensure that, to help mitigate that risk. And those controls can be administrative controls, technical controls, physical controls that can help with that.
So let's talk a little bit about that, because obviously the importance of assessments is something that you and I talk about, Maria talks about. We talk about getting in advance, proactively, to help mitigate risk and avoid possibilities of scariest things like litigation and loss of information from your world. But it's not just it, Barry, is that, to your last point, the challenge is that I'm a business owner. It's now mid-April. Phil just told me that a lot of my key deadlines have passed for taxes. That's great. We have extensions on those. But now it's been nearly a month, and my employees are essentially, they've left the office. I'm aware of business process integrity issues. I consulted with you before, but I don't really know what does that really mean as far as contending with my long-term economic survival. What are some recommendations you would make now, in practical speak, for me?
Yeah, well, as I said, the first recommendation is start with a risk assessment. The world has changed. Understand what the new risks are to the organization because of the location of employees. And some of those risks have to do with new vulnerabilities. No, the employer does not control the home network. That means anything that's on that network is something that, if it's not managed, that it can become a vulnerability. And if, for instance, you're using employees are using virtual private networks or VPNs to connect to the corporate network, that means anything on that home network is part of your business network now.
That's a very important point. But anything on the home network, not just your computer, but anything on the home network itself is now part of the...
Is now potentially has the ability to get to the business network.
And so I want to put a pause there and ask Marie and Anita, when you hear that, and I'm sure you've already considered this possibility, but now you hear an information security and privacy expert saying exactly that. What are some of the thoughts you have, and I'll start with Marie, as far as the risk implications there?
Well, from an employment perspective, one of the things we recommend to employers, if possible, is to provide to the employees all the equipment that the employees need to use. Make sure that the employees understand that it's the employer's equipment. They have it in terms of ownership and also in terms of privacy, that the employer has and will monitor. And so they have no expectation of privacy in that equipment, and that they can only use that equipment for purposes of work, and they need to use their own stuff for their own, whatever work they do personally for themselves and whatever social activities they have. And to the extent you can segregate those as much as possible, I'll leave it to Barry to talk about the technological advantages of that, but certainly from an employment perspective, it helps a lot to separate out what's work equipment that can be used only for work and what is their personal equipment that they can use for whatever they want.
So and that's really interesting, because that also changes the perspective of how do you do that assessment. You really need the cooperation and collaboration of your workforce to help you ascertain what's yours and what's theirs and what's ours, so to speak.
Absolutely, and it's a little more challenging now because in pre-pandemic, like for instance, you'd have the IT person go to the person's house and help them get set up. Now, You don't want to have anybody go to their house. You really can't have anybody go to their house. So there's more collaboration, and there's also more of a trust factor involved as well.
And that's an excellent point. That Anita brings up the point. So how do you protocol this kind of thing? How do you write the policies for this? And I think you and I talked about how it's changing so fast. What would you tell employers in terms of they've had sound policies and procedures, great handbooks in place, even accommodating for things like remote work? and now we have to reshuffle them again. What's some of the first steps they should do in talking to someone like you before they should meet someone like Marie?
Right. Well, one of the caveats about working from home, especially for homes that have access to a service like Alexa, is that we need to understand that there are going to be confidential business conversations going on. So something like a service like Alexa, you want to turn that off before your employee gets involved in a very confidential type of conversation, either with other people on a Zoom call from the workplace or with clients. In addition, even though an employee may be using a virtual private network in order to receive or send information, A, is it encrypted? Does it need to be encrypted? And then B, let's say that an employee is receiving a confidential document, but they choose to print it out because they want to look at it on their back patio and get some fresh air. Once it's printed, it is no longer confidential. So that's certainly an area where a company needs to communicate very clearly to employees. Are you allowed to print out these documents, whether, even if you have a printer at home? That's not really the issue. Are you allowed to do that? That should be reviewed very carefully. And perhaps it's a situation where maybe you make files shared but readable only so that it can't be downloaded. If there's a way to prevent that, where an employee can access it but not actually edit it or print it, then that would be an advisable way to go. But I'd have to defer to Barry because he's our technical expert, so he'd be able to weigh in and say whether it's possible to make that available.
He certainly would be, and those are actual great practical examples of how to do that. Because you got me to a point of my heart rate was going up fast, and then those are some practical solutions, some good approaches there. Because I have clients that have HIPAA issues, that have government contracts as well with strict security and privacy protocols. It would be hard for the employer to control in a remote, heavily dependent remote environment. So. With that, we'll turn back to you, Barry, and ask you that question about, what is it that business owners should be aware of in terms of, what are these threats really looking like? We're concerned about making sure we're being compliant with regulations. By the example I gave you, HIPAA and the like, privacy laws. But what are these new threats from bad actors that you're seeing? For instance, there's FBI notices, bulletins that are being published. I saw one the other day. You and I talked about this, that they're being published almost daily. So what are these actual threats looking like today in this COVID environment?
Let me answer that, but I'd like to go back to that last question if I can afterwards, because the concept of how to secure the business assets is really the role of the security organization, the chief information security officer, whoever's responsible for security for the organization, working with counsel in the organization and others to make it happen and understand what the options were. But there's a lot more to that discussion that we think about every single minute of the day. So, but with respect to threats, you're absolutely right that this is not a new world. The threats, the attacking to businesses are continuous. This is a fact that people in the security world live with. The fact of the matter is that there are some new approaches that bad actors, that we call them, are taking now that exacerbate the situation. Most of them have to do with phishing attacks, where they're sending emails to people who are no longer next to somebody who cannot, say, is this a real email or is it not a real email? You can't do that. Now you have to figure it out yourself. So that's a pretty important thing. Today, the FBI put out a new alert saying business email compromise is on the rise. Business email compromise is the email sent to somebody who has the authority to say, wire the following set of money to Nigeria, right? And that's on the rise. So phishing attacks are on the rise. New threats to the business network are on the rise because as part of the migration of people to home networks, additional access to the business network had to be made available because of that in many situations. So that creates potential vulnerabilities that can be used by bad actors coming from the internet to attack. And likewise, as I said earlier, the home network is part of the business network.
Right.
When any device on that home network is on a VPN to the business network. So that every device on that network is now a vulnerability to potential vulnerability to the business network. And because of that can be attacked. It wasn't a couple of years ago that home cameras were used because they had a vulnerability, were used as a major denial of service attack against the internet by bad actors simply taking advantage of millions of home cameras and using them as bots to attack. So the home network is a vulnerability, and bad actors are not stupid. They know what the opportunities are.
Yeah, well, that makes sense, Barry. So let me ask you this, because I know here with Business Rising Advisors, we've talked about the aspect that we all provide an expertise that business owners need to be aware of. But when I hear these kinds of things, Barry, they raise issues that are germane to each of our respective areas. But as a business owner, when you hear this, it's frightening information. And not only do I want to stand up straight and strong economically in my business again and with my workforce again, but I have to also contend with the security issues. So in practical speak, what would you let them know as next steps that they can do? Do they call someone like you, who's essentially their outsourced IT lead, or do they also collaborate with folks like me, talk to Marie and Anita about the actual practical ways of communicating with the employees in a way that is effective but also risk averse, or they also consider the expenses they need to put into these things that they didn't think about before, and how that might implicate their accounting side too. So what's the right answer? What's the next step?
So the next step is two things. One is to recognize that security is a team sport, and it's not about IT. It's not about the security organization, which is often separate from IT in many organizations. It's about all parts of the organization working together to figure this out. But there is a methodology to help organizations figure this out, and that is a risk-based methodology. Where you say, what are these things that I'm trying to protect? What is the impact? What is the potential impact of the threats of these things? What are the safeguards I can put in place? And what's the cost of these safeguards? And then you can make business decisions about how do you prioritize and how do you approach what safeguards you're going to put in place. I'm sorry, I try so hard when I speak to business owners not to do this from a fear standpoint, because I think to a large extent, what we can do is do this in such a way that we make rational business decisions based upon risk, not based upon fear. And that requires that we have open communication across those people that are stakeholders. The chief privacy officer, inside counsel, outside counsel that may be focused on privacy and cybersecurity, the human resources and those who are advising human resources with respect to policies that need to be adopted as we change the business. It is really a team sport. And there is an organized way about going about it by starting with risk as the common language.
Those are excellent themes and reminders, and a great approach, Barry. Thank you. You mentioned Phil, fear, which I think was interesting, and I think Phil also talked about this aspect of reacting in a scary time. I heard this acronym the other day, and fear is really sort of false expectations, right? There's also face the expectations and rise. That's another way to look at it too. Is that we're all at a point of unknown. It's very unsettling times, but it's this collaborative approach, is what I'm hearing from you, is the way to take those first steps forward with confidence.
Exactly.
With that, I think that we've covered what we wanted to cover for our first episode today, from the legislation end, from the risk mitigation end, initial concerns that business owners need to be aware of, but also how to position themselves for the going forward. With that, I'd like to thank everybody on this team for being a part of this first episode, and welcome everybody else back again for our next episode. We'll be shooting with more updates on what we've covered today and more new information that you should be aware of as business owners going forward. As business owners in today's world, you are bold. As entrepreneurs, you're aspirational. And as employers and growing businesses, you're inspirational. You were all these things once before, and you will be all these things and more again. My colleagues and I have a shared stake in helping you to rebuild your business. We can conquer the new normal together, because when you stand, we stand with you. With consistent level leadership and decisions made with sound, supportive advisors like those you've heard from today, your business, your teams, and your path forward will be strong again. These are difficult decisions to be made, but you don't have to go it alone. Together, we will be smart, we will be bold. Together, we will rise again. I'm Sajid Gunwarden. See you next time.